Hey there, and welcome to True Scary Stories. Before we dive in, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling us where you're from and what time you're watching. That helps YouTube know you love creepy stories, and it'll keep sending more your way.
8 to Creepy True Ski Trip Horror Stories Story 1. The tracks in the snow. Sarah thought she was going crazy when she first saw them. The tracks appeared overnight, leading from the tree line straight to her cabin window. They weren't human footprints, but they weren't animal tracks either. They were something else entirely. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway at Mount Stevens Ski Resort. Sarah had booked a small cabin on the edge of the property, away from the crowds and noise of the main lodge. She wanted solitude after her messy divorce, just her and the quiet mountain air. The first night went perfectly. She sat by the fireplace with hot chocolate, watching the snow fall through the large windows. The cabin felt cozy and safe, surrounded by tall pine trees that swayed gently in the wind. She went to bed early, exhausted from the drive up the mountain. When she woke up the next morning, that's when she saw them. The tracks were pressed deep into the fresh snow, leading from the dark forest straight to her bedroom window. Each print was about the size of a human foot, but elongated and narrow. There were no toes visible, just smooth indentations that looked almost like hooves. Sarah grabbed her phone and took pictures, her hands shaking slightly. She called the front desk at the resort, but the receptionist just laughed it off. "Probably just elk tracks, ma'am. They come down from the higher elevations sometimes." But Sarah knew elk tracks, and these weren't them. She decided to investigate herself. Following the tracks backward, she walked into the tree line where they originated. The prints led deep into the forest, weaving between trees and over fallen logs. After about a quarter mile, they simply stopped. Not at a clearing or a road, but in the middle of nowhere, as if whatever made them had just vanished into thin air. That night, Sarah made sure all the curtains were closed tight. She pushed a dresser in front of the door and kept a kitchen knife on her nightstand. Around 3 a.m. she heard it, soft tapping on her bedroom window like fingernails on glass. Tap, tap, tap. Then silence. Then the tapping started again, moving around the cabin from window to window. Sarah was too terrified to look. She buried herself under the covers and waited for morning. When dawn finally came, she rushed outside to check for tracks. They were there again, circling the entire cabin. But this time they were accompanied by something else. Long scratches in the wood siding about 8 feet off the ground, too high for any person to make without a ladder. She packed her bags immediately and drove to the main lodge, demanding a different room. The desk clerk, a local man in his 60s, took one look at her photos and his face went pale. He quietly moved her to a room in the main building on the 3rd floor. "Don't go back to that cabin," he whispered when no one else was around. "We've had problems with that area before." "What kind of problems?" Sarah asked. The man looked around nervously. "Things that shouldn't exist. We don't rent that cabin out much anymore, but corporate makes us keep it available." He paused, then added, "You're the 3rd person this winter who's reported those tracks." That night in the lodge, Sarah felt safer surrounded by other guests. But around 2 a.m., she was woken by screaming from somewhere outside. She looked out her window and saw people gathered in the parking lot, pointing toward the forest. In the distance, she could see a tall, dark figure moving between the trees. It walked upright like a person, but its movements were wrong, too fluid and quick. Security guards rushed toward the forest with flashlights, but they found nothing. Just more of those strange tracks in the snow, leading from the parking lot back into the woods. The next morning, Sarah learned that a guest car had been scratched, with long gouges in the metal that looked exactly like the marks on her cabin. Sarah left the resort that day, cutting her vacation short. But the story doesn't end there. 3 weeks later, she received a call from the resort manager. They were closing the area around her original cabin permanently. 2 more guests had reported encounters with something in those woods, and one person had been found unconscious near the tree line, with no memory of how they got there. The official story was that it was probably a bear with an unusual gait, maybe injured or sick. But Sarah knew better. She'd seen those tracks, felt that presence watching her through the window. Whatever was living in those woods wasn't any kind of bear. To this day, Sarah won't go skiing alone. She always stays in crowded resorts in rooms high off the ground, with good locks on the doors, because she knows that somewhere out there, something is still making those tracks in the snow, still tapping on windows in the dead of night, still watching and waiting for the right moment to reveal itself completely. The Mount Stevens Resort eventually sold that section of property to the state, claiming it was for conservation purposes. But locals know the real reason. They know that some places are better left alone, some tracks are better left unfollowed, and some things that watch from the woods are better left unseen. Story 2. The lift that never stopped. Mike thought he was the luckiest guy on the mountain when he got the chairlift all to himself. It was the end of the day. Most skiers had gone home, and the lift operator waved him onto Chair 7 alone. What he didn't know was that he was about to take the ride of his life. Literally. Chair 7 was the oldest lift at Whistling Pines Resort, a rickety two-person chair that creaked and swayed in the mountain wind. Mike didn't mind. He was an experienced skier who'd been coming to this mountain for 15 years. He knew every trail, every shortcut, every hidden powder stash. As the chair began its slow journey up the mountain, Mike noticed how quiet everything had become. The usual sounds of skiers calling out to each other were gone. The mechanical noise from the snowmaking machines had stopped. Even the wind seemed to have died down. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. About halfway up, Mike realized something was wrong. They should have passed the halfway station by now, but he couldn't see it anywhere. The chair kept climbing higher than he remembered the lift going. He looked back down the mountain, but the base lodge looked impossibly far away, like he was viewing it through the wrong end of a telescope. He tried to check his phone for the time, but there was no signal. The screen showed 4:47 p.m., which was strange because he was sure it had been after 5:01 when he got on the lift. He tapped the screen, but the time didn't change. The digits seemed frozen in place. The chair continued climbing. Mike had ridden this lift hundreds of times, and it usually took about 12 minutes to reach the top. He'd been riding for what felt like at least 20 minutes, maybe 30. The landscape below was becoming unfamiliar. He could see ski runs he'd never noticed before, winding through sections of the mountain he didn't recognize. That's when he saw the other chairs. Behind him, the lift was full of people. Dozens of skiers were riding up the mountain, but they weren't moving or talking. They sat perfectly still, their ski poles held at identical angles, their heads turned toward the summit at the exact same position. Even from a distance, something about them looked wrong. Mike tried to wave at the chair behind him, but the people didn't respond. As that chair got closer, he could see the riders more clearly, and his blood turned cold. Their faces were pale, almost bluish, with dark circles around their eyes. Their mouths hung open slightly, and they stared straight ahead without blinking. They looked like mannequins, or worse, like corpses. He spun around to look ahead and saw more chairs descending from the summit, also full of these strange, motionless passengers. The empty chairs going up, the full chairs coming down, all in perfect sequence. But where were all these people coming from? The mountain had been nearly deserted when he got on. The chair kept climbing. Mike looked at his phone again. Still 4:47 p.m. He tried calling for help, shouting down at the base lodge, but his voice seemed to get swallowed by the mountain air. No one down below seemed to hear him or even notice that Chair 7 was still running. After what felt like an hour, Mike finally saw the top station approaching. But it wasn't the familiar building he knew. This structure was older, made of dark wood that looked weathered and rotted. Icicles hung from the roof like teeth, and the windows were boarded up. A sign by the exit ramp read Whistling Pines Resort, Esther 1962, closed due to avalanche. But that couldn't be right. The resort had been open for business when he arrived that morning. He'd bought his lift ticket at the same base lodge he'd been visiting for years. He'd talked to other skiers, ridden other lifts. Everything had been normal. As his chair approached the unloading area, Mike saw the lift operator waiting for him. The man wore an old-fashioned ski patrol uniform with a red cross on the chest. His face was hidden in shadow under his cap, but Mike could see his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "End of the line," the operator said in a voice that sounded like it was coming from far away. "Please exit to your right." Mike got off the chair on shaking legs. The moment his skis touched the snow, everything changed. The sounds of the mountain came rushing back. Wind through the trees, the distant hum of snowmaking machines, voices calling from the slopes below. He spun around, but the old lift station was gone. In its place stood the modern building he recognized with its bright lights and cheerful signs. He looked at his phone. 5:23 p.m. Normal time ticking forward like it should. He had a dozen missed calls from his wife wondering where he was. Mike skied down the mountain as fast as he could, his heart pounding the entire way. At the base lodge, he found the lift operator for Chair 7, a young guy named Danny who Mike had seen many times before. "How was your ride?" Danny asked cheerfully. "How long was I up there?" Mike asked. Danny checked his watch. "About 12 minutes, same as always. You were the last rider before we shut down for the day." Mike wanted to argue, to explain what had happened, but how could he? Who would believe him? Instead, he just nodded and skied to his car. As he was loading his gear, another skier approached him. "Weird ride up Chair 7 today, wasn't it?" The stranger said quietly. Mike froze. "What do you mean?" "The other passengers. All those people who never moved, never blinked. And that old station at the top." The stranger shook his head. "I've been skiing here for 30 years, and that happens every few seasons. Always on Chair 7, always at closing time. Management knows about it, but they'll never admit it." The stranger walked away before Mike could ask any more questions. Mike never rode Chair 7 again, and he started leaving the mountain well before closing time. But sometimes, on quiet evenings, he'll drive past the resort and look up at the mountain. On clear nights, he can see the lights of Chair 7 still running long after the mountain is closed, carrying its load of silent passengers up into the darkness. The resort's official records show that Chair 7 was built in 1987, but local newspaper archives tell a different story. The original lift was constructed in 1962 and operated until 1978, when an avalanche buried the top station. 13 skiers were trapped on the lift during the slide. Their bodies were never recovered. Story 3. The Thing in Cabin. 13 Jessica should have known something was wrong when they offered her cabin 13 at a 50% discount. "It's just because of the number," the reservation clerk had explained over the phone. "Some people are superstitious." But Jessica wasn't superstitious. She was practical, and she needed a cheap place to stay during her ski vacation. Pinewood Resort was a small, family-owned operation tucked into a valley between two mountain peaks. The cabins were spread out among the trees, each one offering privacy and mountain views. Cabin 13 sat at the end of a winding dirt road, farther from the main lodge than the others. But Jessica didn't mind the isolation. She arrived on a Sunday evening in February, during a heavy snowstorm. The cabin was exactly what she'd hoped for. Rustic but comfortable, with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and a bedroom with a view of the ski slopes. She unpacked her gear, started a fire, and settled in for the night with a book and a glass of wine. Around midnight, she heard the first thump. It came from somewhere above her, like something heavy had fallen in the attic. Jessica looked up at the ceiling, listening carefully. The cabin was old, she reasoned. Old buildings made noise, especially in snowstorms. She went back to her book. 20 minutes later, she heard it again. Thump. Then silence. Then another thump. Like someone was walking around up there with heavy boots. But there was no attic access that she could see, and the caretaker had assured her that no one else had keys to the cabin. Jessica grabbed a flashlight and went outside to look at the roof. Snow was falling heavily, and she could barely see through the darkness. The roof looked normal. No broken shingles, no obvious places where an animal could get inside. She was about to go back in when she noticed something odd. There were no footprints in the snow around the cabin except her own. But the thumping was definitely coming from above. Back inside, the noises had stopped. Jessica convinced herself it was just the old building settling and went to bed. She'd had a long drive and wanted to get up early for skiing. She woke up at 3 a.m. to the sound of scratching. Long, deliberate scratches like claws or fingernails dragging across wood. The sound was coming from directly above her bed. Jessica lay still, listening, her heart pounding. Scratch, 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 a pause. Then more scratching, moving slowly across the ceiling from one side of the room to the other. This wasn't the building settling. This was something alive, something with claws, something big enough to make those heavy thumping sounds. Jessica grabbed her phone to call the front desk, but there was no signal. The storm must have knocked out the cell towers. The scratching stopped suddenly. Jessica waited in the darkness, straining to hear any other sounds. After about 10 minutes of silence, she started to relax. Maybe it really was just an animal, a raccoon or a possum that had somehow gotten into the roof space. She was drifting back to sleep when she heard a new sound, breathing. Deep, slow breathing coming from somewhere above her, but it wasn't coming from the ceiling. It sounded closer, like it was right in the room with her. Jessica clicked on her flashlight and swept it around the bedroom. Empty corners, closed closet door, nothing under the window. She aimed the light upward and screamed. There was a hole in the ceiling directly above her bed, about 3 feet across, with jagged edges like something had clawed its way through. And hanging down from that hole, staring at her with yellow eyes, was a face she would never forget. It wasn't quite human and wasn't quite animal. The features were elongated, with a mouth full of sharp teeth and skin that looked gray and mottled. Long black hair hung down around its face, and its yellow eyes reflected her flashlight beam like a cat's. But the worst part was that it was smiling at her, a wide grin that showed too many teeth. Jessica rolled out of bed and ran for the door, but it slammed shut before she could reach it. She pulled on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Behind her, she heard something large drop from the ceiling onto her bed with a heavy thud. She spun around, pressing her back against the door. The thing was crouched on her mattress, still grinning. It was bigger than she'd realized. Maybe 7 feet tall when standing, with arms that seemed too long for its body. Its hands ended in claws that looked like they could tear through wood, which explained the hole in the ceiling. "Hello, Jessica," it said in a voice like gravel scraping against glass. "I've been waiting for you. What do you want?" she whispered. "I want what I always want from the people who stay in my cabin. Company." The thing tilted its head, studying her. "It gets so lonely up there in the crawl space. So quiet, so cold. I like it much better down here where it's warm, where there are people to talk to." Jessica realized this wasn't the first time this had happened. What happened to the other guests? The thing's grin grew wider. "Some of them stayed to keep me company. Others weren't very friendly. I don't like unfriendly people, Jessica. They make me angry." Jessica's hand found the door handle behind her back. She tried turning it slowly, quietly. It moved slightly. "I can smell your fear," the thing continued, sniffing the air, sweet and sharp like copper pennies. "It's been so long since I had a guest. The resort stopped putting people in this cabin after the last incident. But then you came along, all alone, asking for the cheapest room. Lucky me." The door handle turned completely. Jessica took a deep breath and yanked the door open, stumbling out into the snow in her pajamas. She didn't stop to grab her keys or her phone or anything else. She just ran through the storm toward the main lodge, her bare feet numb in the snow. Behind her, she heard the thing laughing, a sound like breaking glass. But it didn't follow her. When she looked back, she saw it standing in the doorway of cabin 13, watching her go. Still grinning, Jessica made it to the main lodge and pounded on the doors until the night manager let her in. She was hypothermic and barely coherent, babbling about monsters and holes in ceilings. They wrapped her in blankets and called an ambulance. The next morning, after she'd been treated for frostbite, resort management went to investigate cabin 13. They found her belongings undisturbed. No hole in the ceiling, no signs of any struggle. The cabin looked perfectly normal, but they also found something else. In the crawl space above the bedroom, they discovered personal belongings from dozens of previous guests dating back 20 years. Clothes, jewelry, driver's licenses, credit cards, all from people who had stayed in cabin 13 and then disappeared without checking out. The resort quietly demolished cabin 13 the following week, claiming it was due to structural issues. They scattered the guest belongings in the forest, and they never spoke publicly about what they'd found. The official story was that Jessica had suffered a psychological breakdown brought on by isolation and altitude sickness. But Jessica knows what she saw. And sometimes, late at night, she still dreams about that grinning face and those yellow eyes. She's never been skiing since, and she never stays in cabins anymore, because she knows that some places have residents who don't appear on any lease, who don't pay rent, and who don't like to be disturbed. The land where cabin 13 once stood remains empty. Sometimes hikers report hearing scratching sounds coming from underground and finding holes in the forest floor that look like they were clawed from below. But the resort insists there's nothing there now but trees and snow and empty ground. Story 4. The Whiteout. When the weather report called for possible light snow, Tom figured it was perfect conditions for backcountry skiing. He was an expert skier with 15 years of experience in the mountains, and he knew the terrain around Crystal Peak like the back of his hand. What he didn't know was that some storms don't follow weather reports, and some mountains have their own rules about who gets to leave. Tom set out early Tuesday morning with his avalanche gear, GPS, and enough supplies for a full day in the backcountry. The resort was crowded with tourists, but beyond the boundary ropes lay thousands of acres of untouched powder snow. He skinned up the familiar trail toward the ridge, planning to ski some of his favorite hidden bowls. The morning was perfect. Clear skies, no wind, and snow conditions that dreams are made of. Tom made several runs through pristine powder, each one better than the last. He was having the time of his life, completely alone in a winter wonderland. Around 2 p.m., he noticed clouds building on the horizon. They looked heavier and darker than the weather forecast had predicted, but he figured he had plenty of time for one more run before heading back. That's when he made the mistake that would change his life forever. The storm hit like a wall. One moment Tom was skiing down a gentle slope in bright sunlight, and the next moment he was surrounded by a whiteout so complete he couldn't see his own skis. The wind picked up from nowhere, howling across the mountain and driving snow horizontally into his face. Tom stopped immediately and tried to get his bearings. In a whiteout, even experienced skiers can become disoriented within seconds. Up and down become meaningless concepts when everything around you is the same shade of white. He pulled out his GPS, but the screen showed only static. The storm was so intense it was interfering with the satellite signal. He tried to retrace his path by feel, but the wind had already filled in his ski tracks. The storm was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. The snow was coming down so hard it felt like being inside a washing machine. He couldn't hear anything except the roar of wind, couldn't see anything except swirling white. Tom knew the rules of survival in a whiteout. Stay calm, stay put, and wait for the storm to pass. He found what felt like a tree and took shelter against it, pulling out his emergency bivy sack. But as he settled in to wait, he realized something was wrong with the storm itself. The wind was coming from all directions at once, which was meteorologically impossible. The snow wasn't falling down, but seemed to be moving in spirals and patterns that defied gravity. And strangest of all, he could hear voices in the wind, distant voices calling his name. Tom. Tom. Over here, Tom. He stood up, listening carefully. The voices sounded like his friends from the ski patrol, like they were searching for him, but that didn't make sense. No one knew where he'd gone, and he hadn't been reported missing yet. Still, the voices were clear and distinct, coming from somewhere ahead of him in the whiteout. Against his better judgment, Tom began following the voices. They seemed to be leading him downhill, which should have been the right direction back toward the resort. But as he skied slowly through the storm, the voices kept moving, always just ahead of him, always just out of reach. This way, Tom. We can see you. Keep coming. Tom skied for what felt like hours, following the voices through the endless white. His legs were getting tired and he was starting to panic. The storm showed no signs of letting up and he was beginning to realize he might be truly lost. But the voices kept calling, so he kept following. Eventually, he came to a clearing where the wind seemed to die down slightly. Tom could make out the shapes of buildings through the snow. A cluster of cabins and what looked like a ski lodge. Relief flooded through him. He'd made it to some kind of mountain shelter. But as he skied closer, Tom realized the buildings looked wrong. They were old, much older than any structure he knew in the area. The logs were dark with age and the roof sagged under the weight of accumulated snow. Some of the windows were boarded up, and those that weren't showed only darkness inside. The voices were coming from the largest building, which looked like it had once been a lodge or hotel. Tom could see warm light flickering in the windows and smoke rising from the chimney. People were definitely inside, and right now that was all that mattered. He skied up to the front door and knocked. The door opened immediately, as if someone had been waiting for him. A man in old-fashioned ski clothes greeted him with a smile. "Tom, we've been expecting you. Come in, get out of that storm." The man was tall and thin, with pale skin and dark eyes that seemed to reflect the firelight. His ski outfit looked like something from the 1950s, and there was something odd about the way he moved. Too fluid and graceful. Inside, the lodge was warm and inviting. A fire crackled in a massive stone fireplace, and Tom could smell coffee and hot soup. Other people sat in chairs around the room, all wearing vintage ski clothes and all turning to smile at him as he entered. "Welcome to the Storm's End Lodge," the man said, helping Tom out of his wet gear. "You're safe now. The storm can't reach you here." Tom was grateful to be out of the cold, but something felt off about the place. The other guests were too quiet, too still. They smiled and nodded at him, but no one spoke. And their skin had the same pale quality as the man who'd answered the door. "I need to call the resort," Tom said. "People will be worried about me." "Oh, there's no need for that," the man replied smoothly. "The storm has knocked out all the phone lines. Besides, you're perfectly safe here. Why don't you sit by the fire and warm up? Have some soup." Tom sat down, and one of the silent guests brought him a bowl of soup that smelled amazing. But when he looked down at it, the liquid was dark red, almost black, and it seemed to move in the bowl like it was alive. "What kind of soup is this?" Tom asked. "A local specialty," the man said. "It'll warm you right up, give you strength for the journey ahead." "What journey?" The man's smile grew wider, showing teeth that looked too sharp. "Why, the journey to join us permanently, of course. You see, Tom, people who come to Storm's End Lodge during the whiteout don't usually leave. They like it here so much they decide to stay forever." Tom looked around the room with new eyes. The other guests weren't breathing. Their chests didn't rise and fall, and when the firelight flickered across their faces, he could see that their eyes were completely white. No pupils at all. "What happened to them?" Tom whispered. "They're resting," the man said, "waiting for the next storm, the next lost skier to join our family. It's quite peaceful, actually. No more cold, no more fear, no more struggling through life. Just eternal rest in the warmth of our lodge." Tom stood up quickly, backing toward the door. "I need to leave now." "I'm afraid that's not possible," the man said calmly. "The storm won't let you leave, and neither will we." Tom grabbed his gear and ran for the door, but it wouldn't open. He pulled and pushed, but it was like the door had been sealed shut. Behind him, he heard the man laughing, and the sound of chairs creaking as the other guests began to stand up. In desperation, Tom threw himself against one of the windows. The glass shattered, and he tumbled out into the storm with his skis and poles. The whiteout was still raging, but he didn't care. He had to get away from that place. He put on his skis and pushed off into the storm, not caring which direction he was going. Behind him, he could hear voices calling his name again, but now they sounded angry, frustrated. The storm seemed to get worse, as if it was trying to push him back toward the lodge. Tom skied blindly through the whiteout for hours, falling and getting up, crashing into trees, completely lost. Just when he thought he couldn't go any farther, the storm began to clear. The wind died down, the snow stopped falling, and suddenly he could see where he was. He was at the base of Crystal Peak Resort, right where he'd started that morning. The parking lot was full of search and rescue vehicles, and people were calling his name. Real people, warm and alive, with normal voices full of concern. Tom collapsed in the snow, exhausted and hypothermic. The rescue team found him and rushed him to the hospital, where he spent 2 days recovering from exposure. When he told them about the lodge and the pale man and the other guests, they said he'd been hallucinating from hypothermia and oxygen deprivation. But Tom knows what he experienced was real. He's never been backcountry skiing since, and he won't go out in any storm, no matter how light the forecast claims it will be, because he knows that some storms are hunting grounds, some voices in the wind are not there to help, and some shelters in the mountains are designed to keep people forever. The search and rescue team found no trace of any lodge in the area where Tom claimed to have been. But local records show that a place called Storm's End Lodge operated in that region from 1952 to 1967, when it was abandoned after several guests disappeared during winter storms. The building was supposedly demolished in the 1970s, but no one can find any records of the demolition permits. And every winter when the big storms hit Crystal Peak, search and rescue teams report the same thing. Voices in the wind calling the names of missing skiers, leading them deeper into the wilderness instead of towards safety. Story 5. The frozen man. Lisa thought she'd seen everything in her 10 years as a ski patrol member at Alpine Valley Resort. Broken bones, heart attacks, avalanche victims, she'd dealt with it all. But nothing had prepared her for what she found on the north face of Mount Harrison on that frigid January morning. The call came in around 9 a.m. A skier had spotted something unusual near the old mining trail, about 2 miles from the main ski area. "Looks like maybe someone had an accident," the caller had reported. "But it's weird. You should probably check it out." Lisa and her partner Jake loaded their rescue sleds and headed up the mountain. It was brutally cold that day, with temperatures hovering around -15 degrees and a wind that cut through even the best winter gear. Not many people were skiing, and certainly no one was venturing into the backcountry. They found the spot easily enough. The skier who'd called it in had left markers in the snow, bright orange surveyor's tape tied to trees. Following the trail markers, they snowshoed about 100 yards into the forest before they saw it. There was a man sitting against a large pine tree, perfectly upright, staring straight ahead. He was wearing ski clothes, but they looked old, maybe from the 1980s. A bright blue jacket and matching pants that were now faded and weathered. His skis and poles lay nearby, partially buried in snow. "Sir?" Lisa called out as they approached. "Are you okay?" The man didn't respond. He didn't move at all. As they got closer, Lisa realized why. He was frozen solid, had been for a very long time. His skin was gray-white and ice crystals covered his eyebrows and beard. But the strangest part was his expression. He looked calm, almost peaceful, like he'd simply decided to sit down and rest. "Jesus," Jake whispered. "How long has he been here?" Lisa examined the body without touching it. The man's clothes were covered in a layer of ice, and snow had accumulated around his legs and torso. He'd been there through several storms, maybe weeks or even months. But something didn't make sense about the scene. "Look at this," she said, pointing to the snow around the tree. "There's no sign of a struggle, no evidence that he tried to get up or call for help. It's like he just sat down and stopped." They called it into the sheriff's department and waited for the coroner and investigation team to arrive. While they waited, Lisa studied the scene more carefully. The man's position was too perfect, too composed. People who freeze to death usually show signs of hypothermia. They remove their clothes, they curl up in a fetal position. They show evidence of confusion and disorientation. This man looked like he'd posed for a photograph. The investigation team arrived and began processing the scene. The coroner confirmed that the man had been dead for at least 6 weeks, possibly longer. His body was so frozen that they'd need to wait for it to thaw before they could perform an autopsy. But the real mystery came when they tried to identify him. His driver's license showed his name as Robert Chen, age 34, from Denver. But when they ran his information, they discovered something impossible. Robert Chen had died in a skiing accident at the exact same spot in 1987. He'd been missing for 3 days before his body was found sitting against the same tree, in the same position, wearing the same clothes. "That's impossible," the sheriff said when the records came back. "We must have the wrong ID." But the fingerprints matched. The dental records matched. Even the serial numbers on his ski equipment matched the evidence logged from the 1987 case. According to every official record, they'd found the same man who had died 35 years earlier. Lisa was disturbed by the whole thing, but what happened next made it even worse. 2 days later, she was called back to the same area. Another hiker had reported seeing someone sitting against a tree, someone who looked like they needed help. This time it was a woman in her 40s, wearing ski clothes from the 1990s. She was frozen solid, sitting in the same peaceful position, against a tree about 50 yards from where they'd found Robert Chen. Like Robert, she showed no signs of struggle or distress. She looked like she'd simply decided to sit down and wait. The woman's ID showed her name as Margaret Torres, and the records check revealed the same impossible truth. Margaret Torres had died in a skiing accident in that area in 1994. She'd been found sitting against a tree, frozen solid, in exactly the same position. Lisa was starting to panic. "This doesn't make any sense," she told Jake. "Dead people don't just reappear 30 years later." But Jake was looking at something else. "Lisa," he said quietly, "look at the trees." She followed his gaze and felt her blood turn cold. There were more trees in the area, dozens of them, all large pines with thick trunks, and now that she was looking carefully, she could see shapes against several of them, shapes that looked like people sitting in the snow. They approached the nearest tree cautiously. Sure enough, there was another frozen figure, a man in ski clothes from what looked like the 1970s. He had the same peaceful expression, the same composed position. His equipment lay nearby, partially buried in snow. They found 12 more bodies that day, all frozen solid, all sitting against trees in the same small area of forest. The clothing styles ranged from the 1960s to the 2000s, suggesting they'd been appearing over many decades. All of them had the same peaceful expression, the same composed posture. The sheriff's department was baffled. When they ran the identities of all the frozen people, every single one came back as someone who had died in skiing accidents in that exact area, going back 50 years. But according to the records, all of these bodies had already been found, buried, and their cases closed decades ago. "It's like they keep coming back," Lisa told her supervisor that night, "like something is calling them back to that place." Her supervisor, a man who'd worked the mountain for 30 years, went quiet. Finally, he said, "There are stories about that area, old stories that go back to when the mountain was first opened for skiing. They say it's a place where people get lost, where they sit down to rest and never get up again." "What kind of stories?" "The Ute Indians who used to hunt in these mountains called it the sitting place. They said it was where the spirits of people who died in winter would return to wait for spring that never comes." He paused, looking uncomfortable. The ski patrol has had reports from that area for decades. Skiers who get lost and find people sitting against trees. People who offer to help them find their way back. But when the skiers return with help, there's never anyone there. Lisa felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold mountain air. "You think the frozen people are still active?" "I think that area is dangerous in ways we don't understand, and I think you should stay away from it." But Lisa couldn't stay away. She was haunted by the image of all those peaceful faces, all those people who had simply sat down and stopped living. She started researching the history of the area, digging through old newspaper archives and accident reports. What she found terrified her. Dating back to the 1940s, there were reports of skiers and hikers going missing in that specific area. Most were eventually found, but always in the same condition, sitting against trees, frozen solid, with expressions of perfect peace. The strange part was that many of the victims were experienced outdoorsmen who should have known better than to just sit down and wait to die. But there were other reports too, reports that the sheriff's department had tried to keep quiet. Witnesses who claimed they'd been lost in the area and were helped by friendly strangers, people who appeared out of nowhere, offered directions, and then vanished when the witness looked away. People who matched the descriptions of the frozen victims. Lisa decided to investigate for herself. On her day off, she snowshoed back to the area alone, against all safety protocols and common sense. She wanted to understand what was happening in that forest. The day was clear and cold with fresh snow covering the ground. Lisa found the spot where they'd discovered the bodies, though they'd all been removed by now. The forest looked peaceful, almost inviting, with sunlight filtering through the pine branches. She was examining the base of one of the trees when she heard a voice behind her. "Beautiful day for skiing, isn't it?" Lisa spun around and saw a man standing about 20 feet away. He was wearing ski clothes that looked like they were from the 1980s, a bright blue jacket that seemed familiar. He was smiling at her, but there was something wrong with his eyes. They looked cloudy, almost white. "You're Robert Chen," Lisa whispered. The man nodded. "I've been waiting here for a while. It's so peaceful, so quiet. Would you like to sit with me?" "I know a wonderful spot right over there." Lisa backed away, her heart pounding. "You're dead. We found your body." Robert laughed, a sound like wind through the trees. "Death is just another kind of rest. A very long, very peaceful rest." "You look tired, Lisa. Why don't you sit down for a while?" More figures were emerging from behind the trees now. Lisa recognized some of them from the frozen bodies they'd found. Margaret Torres, a man in 1970s ski gear, others wearing clothes from different decades. They all had the same peaceful expressions, the same cloudy eyes. "Sit with us," Margaret said gently. "It's so warm here, so comfortable. No more cold, no more pain, no more worry. Just peace." Lisa realized they were surrounding her, moving slowly but steadily closer. Their faces were kind, their voices soothing, but she could see frost forming on their skin, ice crystals in their hair. They weren't alive, not in any way that mattered. "The mountain needs caretakers," Robert explained as they closed in. "People to guide lost souls to their final rest. People to help them find peace. You understand peace, don't you, Lisa? You've seen so much pain in your work, so much suffering. Wouldn't you like for it to stop?" Lisa pulled out her radio, but it just crackled with static. The frozen people were only 10 feet away now, reaching out to her with hands that looked blue-white in the sunlight. "Just sit down," Margaret urged. "Just for a minute. Just to see how nice it feels." Lisa ran. She crashed through the forest, stumbling over logs and through deep snow, not caring about direction or safety. Behind her, she could hear the voices calling, but they didn't sound angry. They sounded disappointed, like parents whose child had refused to come home. She made it back to the ski area in record time, her lungs burning from the cold air and exertion. She immediately reported what had happened, but her supervisor just looked at her with concern. "Lisa, you were alone in a dangerous area. Hypothermia can cause hallucinations. You know that." But Lisa knew what she'd seen. She submitted her resignation that week and moved to a city far from any mountains. She's never been skiing since, and she never goes anywhere that snow falls heavily, because she knows that some places in the mountains aren't just dangerous. They're hungry. They collect people, preserve them in ice and cold, and use them to lure others to the same fate. She knows that death isn't always the end, that sometimes it's just the beginning of a very long shift as a mountain's caretaker. The area where Lisa encountered the frozen people has been officially closed to the public. Signs warn of unstable terrain and avalanche danger, but those aren't the real reasons. Local ski patrol members know the truth, and they make sure no one goes there alone. But sometimes, on clear winter days, hikers report seeing people in outdated ski clothes standing among the trees, waving and calling out offers to help. The smart ones wave back and keep moving. The others, the ones who think they've found friendly fellow skiers willing to share directions or offer assistance, sometimes join the eternal gathering in the forest, and every year, the mountain adds a few more caretakers to its collection. Story 6. The ski mask. Danny found the ski mask in a lost and found bin that hadn't been cleaned out in years. It was buried under old gloves and forgotten goggles. A simple black mask with holes for the eyes and mouth. Nothing fancy, nothing expensive, just basic protection against the cold. He almost didn't take it, but his own mask had torn that morning, and he couldn't afford to buy a new one. Pine Ridge was a small mountain with cheap lift tickets, the kind of place where college kids and working families went to ski. Danny fit into both categories. He was a college student who worked weekends at the resort's rental shop to help pay for his season pass. The mask looked clean enough, and it was free. What could go wrong? The first time Danny wore the mask, he noticed the difference immediately. He'd been skiing Pine Ridge for 3 years and knew every trail, every turn, every bump. But wearing the mask, everything looked different. The runs seemed steeper, the trees closer together, the whole mountain more threatening than he remembered. More importantly, he was skiing better than he ever had in his life. Danny was an intermediate skier at best, someone who stuck to groomed blue runs and avoided anything too challenging. But wearing the mask, he felt confident attacking steep black diamond runs, threading through tight tree sections, hitting jumps he'd never dared attempt before. Other skiers noticed too. People who'd never given him a second look were stopping to watch him ski. He was carving turns with perfect precision, maintaining balance in situations that should have sent him tumbling. It felt amazing, like he'd suddenly unlocked some hidden potential he'd never known he had. But the mask felt strange on his face. The fabric seemed thicker than it looked, and it fitted too perfectly, like it had been custom made for his exact head shape. Sometimes, when he was skiing fast, he could swear he felt it tightening slightly, molding itself more closely to his skin. After his third run wearing the mask, Danny stopped at the lodge for lunch. He went to the bathroom to wash up and caught sight of himself in the mirror. For just a moment, looking through the eye holes of the mask, he didn't recognize his own eyes. They looked darker, more intense, like they belonged to someone else entirely. He pulled the mask off and his normal reflection returned. Brown eyes, familiar face, nothing unusual. But when he put the mask back on, that sense of being someone else returned immediately. Someone better at skiing. Someone more confident. Someone who wasn't afraid of the mountain. That afternoon, Danny attempted his first double black diamond run. Widow's Peak was a steep, narrow trail that dropped down the north face of the mountain, full of moguls and exposed rocks. He'd never even considered skiing it before, but wearing the mask, it looked manageable. He was halfway down the trail when he realized he wasn't in control anymore. His legs were moving independently of his conscious thought, making perfect turns through sections that should have been impossible to navigate. He wasn't skiing the mountain. Something else was, using his body. Danny tried to stop, but his skis kept moving. He tried to turn toward the easier escape route, but his body continued straight down the steepest part of the trail. It was like being a passenger in his own body, watching someone else ski with his legs. The worst part was that whoever was controlling him was an incredible skier. They were making turns that Danny couldn't have made in a million years, maintaining perfect form through terrain that would challenge Olympic athletes. But it wasn't him doing it. At the bottom of the run, control suddenly returned to Danny's body. He skidded to a stop, gasping and shaking. Other skiers nearby were staring at him with admiration and amazement. "Dude, that was incredible," one of them called out. "I've never seen anyone ski Widow's Peak like that." Danny yanked off the mask and immediately felt normal again. Just a regular college student who worked at the rental shop. Someone who definitely couldn't ski double black diamonds. But the moment he put the mask back on, that confidence returned, along with the unsettling feeling that he wasn't alone in his own head. That night, Danny researched the history of Pine Ridge Resort, trying to understand what he'd experienced. What he found in old newspaper archives made his blood run cold. In 1987, a professional skier named Marcus Webb had died on Widow's Peak during a promotional event for the resort. He'd been attempting a dangerous stunt run when he hit a tree at high speed. Webb was known for his aggressive skiing style and his signature black ski mask, which he wore in all his competitions. The newspaper photos showed Webb wearing what looked exactly like the mask Danny had found. Same black fabric, same simple design, same perfect fit. According to the article, Webb's body had been found wearing all his ski gear except for the mask, which was never recovered. Danny stared at the photo for a long time. Webb had been an amazing skier, someone who could handle any terrain the mountain had to offer. Someone who might not want to stop skiing just because he'd died. The next day, Danny decided to test his theory. He wore the mask up to the top of Widow's Peak, the same run where Webb had died. Standing at the edge of the trail looking down the steep slope, Danny felt that familiar shift in his consciousness. Suddenly, the run didn't look intimidating at all. It looked like home. He pushed off and immediately lost control of his body again. But this time he was more aware of what was happening. He could feel another presence in his mind. Someone experienced and confident. Someone who knew every inch of this mountain. Someone who was using Danny's body to ski the runs he'd never ski again on his own. Halfway down Widow's Peak, Danny passed the tree where Webb had crashed. As his body turned past it, he felt a wave of emotion that wasn't his own. Sadness, regret, and a desperate need to keep skiing, to prove that the accident had been a fluke. At the bottom of the run, Danny pulled off the mask and threw it in his backpack. His hands were shaking and he was covered in sweat despite the cold mountain air. He'd just skied a run that was completely beyond his abilities, guided by someone who'd been dead for 35 years. But the scary part was that he'd enjoyed it. For those few minutes, he'd been the best skier on the mountain. He'd felt the pure joy of perfect technique, of dancing with gravity and winning. It was addictive. Over the next week, Danny found himself putting on the mask more and more often. Each time, Webb's presence seemed stronger, more in control. Danny was becoming a passenger in his own life. watching through the eye holes of the mask as someone else lived his dreams of being an expert skier. His friends noticed the change. "You've gotten so much better," they said. "It's like you're a completely different person on the slopes." That's because he was. Danny was disappearing little by little each time he wore the mask. Webb's personality was stronger, more experienced, more confident. Danny was just a college kid who worked in a rental shop. Webb was a professional athlete who devoted his entire life to skiing. The final incident happened on a busy Saturday afternoon. Danny, wearing the mask, was skiing through a crowded section near the base lodge when a small child fell directly in front of him. Any normal skier would have crashed or turned away, but Webb's reflexes were superhuman. Using Danny's body, he launched into a perfect jump, soaring over the child and landing smoothly beyond. The child was fine, but the incident was caught on video by someone's phone. By evening, the footage was viral on social media. "Mystery skier performs incredible save," read the headlines. Danny was famous, but it wasn't really him who'd made the save. That night, Danny looked at himself in the mirror while wearing the mask. The eyes looking back at him were definitely not his own anymore. They were darker, more intense, with a confidence that Danny had never possessed. When he spoke, his voice sounded different too, deeper and more assured. "Thank you," he heard himself say, but the words weren't coming from his own mind. "I've been waiting so long to ski again." Danny tried to pull off the mask, but his hands wouldn't obey him. Webb was in complete control now, and he had no intention of giving Danny back his body. Why should he? Danny was just a mediocre skier who would waste this body's potential. Webb could make this body into something special, something legendary. "Don't worry," Webb's voice said through Danny's mouth. "I'll take good care of your body. I'll make it into something you could never achieve on your own. I'll make us both immortal." Danny fought back, trying to regain control of his own body, but Webb's will was stronger. The professional skier had spent years training his mind as well as his body, learning to focus completely on his goals. Danny was just a college student who'd never learned real discipline. Over the following months, Danny became a local legend at Pine Ridge. He was skiing runs that even the ski patrol avoided, performing stunts that attracted crowds of spectators. Sponsors started calling, offering endorsement deals. Magazines wanted to do interviews, but Danny himself was gone. His body was still walking around, still going to classes and working at the rental shop, but Webb was in complete control. Danny's consciousness was buried so deep he might as well have been dead. The real Danny's friends and family noticed the change, but they attributed it to newfound confidence and success. "He's really found himself," his mother said proudly. "It's like he's become the person he was always meant to be." In a way, that was exactly what had happened. Danny's body had become the person Webb had always meant to be, an immortal skier who could never be stopped by death or injury. Webb had found the perfect host, someone whose life he could take over completely. The mask still sits in the Lost and Found at Pine Ridge Resort. The staff there know its history now, know what it's capable of, but they can't seem to throw it away. It keeps reappearing, buried under other lost items, waiting for the next skier who needs just a little extra confidence. Local ski patrol members warn people about it, tell stories about Danny and what happened to him. But there are always new skiers, always people who think they know better, who believe they're strong enough to control whatever power the mask contains. And Webb is patient. He's learned that one body doesn't last forever, that eventually he'll need to find a new host. The mask is his anchor to the physical world, his way of transferring from one skier to another. He's already starting to feel Danny's body wearing out from all the extreme skiing, all the stunts and risks that Danny's muscles weren't really built for. Soon he'll need to find someone new, someone young and strong, someone who loves skiing enough to pick up a mysterious mask from a lost and found bin, someone who won't realize what's happening until it's far too late to stop it, because Marcus Webb has no intention of ever stopping his skiing career. Death was just a minor interruption, a temporary setback. Now he has the perfect solution, an endless series of bodies to borrow, an eternal opportunity to pursue the sport he loves. And all it takes is one person desperate enough to wear a mask they found in the trash. Story 7. The Avalanche That Never Stopped. The avalanche started at 11:43 a.m. on February 14th, according to the seismographs at the Mountain Research Station. By all laws of physics, it should have ended by noon. It was a relatively small slide on the backside of Thunder Mountain, the kind that happens dozens of times every winter without anyone even noticing. But this avalanche was different. This one never stopped. Dr. Sarah Chen was the first to notice something was wrong. As the lead researcher at the station, she monitored all seismic activity in the area, tracking everything from minor rockfalls to major avalanches. When the readings for the Thunder Mountain slide kept showing continuous movement after the first hour, she assumed there was a malfunction in the equipment. But when she called the ski patrol to report the potentially faulty sensor, they gave her news that made her question everything she knew about snow physics. The avalanche was still moving. Rangers with binoculars could see it from the observation deck at Thunder Peak Lodge, a massive wall of snow rolling down the mountain in slow motion, like a white waterfall that never ran out of water. Sarah grabbed her emergency gear and snowmobiled up to the observation deck. What she saw through her high-powered telescope defied explanation. The avalanche was moving at about 5 miles per hour, much slower than normal, but it showed no signs of stopping. The snow just kept coming, more and more of it, like the mountain was somehow generating infinite amounts of snow to feed the slide. "How long has it been going?" she asked the ski patrol captain. 4 hours now," he replied grimly, "and it's heading straight for the backcountry camping area. We've evacuated everyone we could find, but there might be people out there we don't know about." Sarah studied the path of the avalanche through her scope. It was following the natural fall line down the mountain, which would take it through several popular camping spots and eventually to the access road that connected Thunder Mountain to the main highway. If it kept going at this pace, it would reach the road by evening, but that was impossible. Avalanches don't last for hours. They expend their energy quickly, usually within minutes. The snow should have settled. The momentum should have died out. The slide should have stopped. Instead, it seemed to be getting larger. "We need to evacuate the road," Sarah told the captain. "If this thing doesn't stop, it's going to cut off access to the entire area." The evacuation began immediately. State highway crews set up roadblocks 5 miles in either direction, and emergency services started moving everyone out of the potential impact zone. But as the hours passed, the avalanche showed no signs of slowing down. By 6 p.m., the slide had been running for over 6 hours and had traveled nearly 30 miles down the mountain. The snow wall was now estimated to be over 200 feet high and half a mile wide. It was moving through forests, over ridges, and across valleys that should have stopped it. But somehow it kept flowing like liquid. Sarah was documenting everything, taking measurements and photos that she knew no one would believe. The avalanche was behaving like no natural phenomenon she'd ever studied. It was too slow, too persistent, and far too large for the amount of snow that should have been available on the mountain. That's when she noticed the reports coming in from other areas. Hikers and hunters throughout the region were calling in sightings of the avalanche from impossible angles. People 20 miles to the east reported seeing it flowing down a completely different mountain. Others reported seeing it moving uphill, which violated every law of gravity. Sarah realized with growing horror that this wasn't just one avalanche. It was multiple avalanches, all moving in perfect synchronization, all part of some larger phenomenon that she couldn't understand. It was like the snow itself had come alive and was actively pursuing some unknown goal. The first casualties were reported around 8 p.m. A group of backcountry skiers had been caught in the edge of the flow near Crystal Lake. Search and rescue teams found their equipment scattered across the slide path, but there were no bodies. The snow had completely swallowed them. But the strangest part was what the rescue teams reported about the snow itself. It wasn't normal avalanche debris, compressed, chunky, and difficult to dig through. This snow was soft, almost fluffy, like fresh powder. Searchers could sink into it up to their waist, but they couldn't find any trace of the missing skiers. "It's like the snow is alive," one rescue worker reported over the radio. "It moves around us as we walk through it. I swear it's trying to grab our legs." Sarah was monitoring all the radio traffic from the command center that had been set up in the valley. The reports were getting more bizarre by the hour. The avalanche was now covering an area of over 100 square miles, flowing in multiple directions simultaneously, sometimes moving uphill against gravity. Around midnight, they lost contact with the search and rescue teams. Their last radio transmission was panicked and unclear. "The snow is rising up around us. It's like it's alive. We can't get out. It's pulling us down." Dawn revealed the true scope of the disaster. The avalanche had covered most of the Thunder Mountain wilderness area and was continuing to spread. Aerial surveys showed a sea of pristine white snow that stretched from horizon to horizon, but there was something wrong with it. The snow was moving in patterns, forming spirals and geometric shapes that changed constantly. Sarah was in one of the survey helicopters when she saw the faces. At first, she thought it was pareidolia, the tendency to see faces in random patterns. But as the helicopter flew lower, she realized the shapes in the snow were actual human faces, dozens of them, all looking up at the aircraft with expressions of terror and pleading. "Do you see that?" she asked the pilot over the intercom. The pilot's face had gone white. "Those are the missing people," he whispered. "They're trapped in the snow, but they're still alive." The faces were moving through the snow like swimmers moving through water. Sarah could see their mouths opening and closing, their eyes tracking the helicopter's movement. They were trying to communicate, trying to call for help, but no sound reached the aircraft. "We have to get them out," Sarah said, but even as she spoke, she knew it was impossible. The avalanche covered hundreds of square miles now, and it was still growing. Even if they could locate the trapped people, how could they dig them out of snow that was behaving like a living thing? The helicopter pilot was backing away from the avalanche zone. "We can't help them," he said grimly. "Look at the edges." Sarah looked where he was pointing and saw that the avalanche was reaching up toward their aircraft. Tendrils of snow were rising into the air like grasping fingers, trying to pull the helicopter down into the white mass below. They barely escaped. As they flew back to the command center, Sarah watched the avalanche continue to spread behind them. It was moving faster now, covering ground at an unprecedented rate. Small towns in the valley were being evacuated as the snow approached. The military was called in that afternoon. Scientists, avalanche experts, and emergency management officials from around the country descended on the area. But no one had ever seen anything like this before. The avalanche was defying every known law of physics and meteorology. Dr. James Morrison, a glaciologist from the University of Colorado, proposed the most disturbing theory. "What if this isn't really snow?" he suggested during an emergency briefing. "What if it's some kind of organism that looks like snow, something that feeds on organic matter?" The idea sounded ridiculous, but it was the only explanation that fit the evidence. The avalanche was behaving like a living thing, hunting, spreading, consuming everything in its path. And the faces trapped within it suggested that it wasn't killing its victims immediately. It was keeping them alive for some purpose. Military jets were deployed to bomb the avalanche, trying to disrupt whatever force was controlling it. The explosives had no effect. The snow simply absorbed the impacts and continued spreading. Worse, after each bombing run, the avalanche seemed to move faster, as if the violence had excited it somehow. By the end of the first week, the avalanche covered over 1,000 square miles and showed no signs of stopping. Satellite imagery revealed that it was spreading in all directions from the original slide point, flowing over mountains and through valleys, consuming everything in its path. The government established a quarantine zone and evacuated everyone within a 50-mile radius of the expanding snowfield. But Sarah couldn't leave. She'd devoted her life to studying avalanches, and this phenomenon was the discovery of a lifetime, assuming she lived long enough to document it properly. From a safe distance, she continued to monitor the avalanche through remote sensors and satellite feeds. What she learned over the following weeks challenged everything she believed about the natural world. The snow wasn't just consuming people and animals. It was learning from them. The patterns it formed became more complex, more purposeful. It began to move in coordinated waves, like a military formation advancing across the landscape, and the faces trapped within it were changing too. At first, the faces had shown terror and confusion, but as weeks passed, their expressions became calmer, more serene. Some even seemed to be smiling. It was as if whatever the snow was doing to them, they were beginning to enjoy it. Sarah's final report submitted to the National Weather Service before she disappeared, contained a chilling conclusion. The entity we're dealing with is not an avalanche in any conventional sense. It appears to be a form of collective consciousness that uses snow as its medium of existence. It's converting human minds into components of its larger intelligence, keeping their bodies alive while integrating their thoughts into its own network. The last anyone heard from Sarah was a radio transmission from her research station. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice dreamy and distant. "I can see how it all connects now. The snow isn't trying to hurt us. It's trying to help us become part of something bigger, something perfect." The transmission cut out, and when rescue teams finally reached her station weeks later, they found it empty. But in the snow around the building, they could see Sarah's face looking up at them, smiling peacefully, her lips moving as if she was trying to tell them something wonderful. The quarantine zone remains in effect today, though it's been expanded several times as the snow continues to spread. Official reports claim it's a toxic spill that will take decades to clean up. But locals know the truth. They know that something is growing in those mountains, something that started as a simple avalanche and became something far more dangerous. And sometimes, on clear winter days, people report seeing faces in the snow on distant peaks, faces of people who went missing years ago, all of them smiling, all of them trying to wave others closer to join them in their perfect, eternal winter. The avalanche never stopped. It's still out there, still growing, still waiting for the next person to get too close to the snow line. Because once it has you, once you become part of its collective consciousness, you don't want to leave. You want to help it grow, help it spread, help it turn the entire world into one endless perfect avalanche. Story 8. The lodge that wasn't there. Kevin was absolutely certain he'd booked a room at the Whispering Pines Lodge. He had the confirmation email on his phone, the credit card charge on his statement, and the GPS coordinates that led him right to the spot. The only problem was that when he arrived, there was no lodge there. Just an empty clearing in the forest and a sign that read, Whispering Pines Lodge, established 1952. Welcome guests. It was getting dark, and Kevin was exhausted from the long drive up the mountain. He'd been planning this ski vacation for months, looking forward to a week of skiing and relaxation at what the website had described as a charming mountain retreat. With rustic accommodations and world-class skiing access, he got out of his car and walked around the clearing, looking for any sign of buildings. There were concrete foundations partly buried under snow, and what looked like the remains of a stone chimney rising from a pile of rubble. But no lodge, no cabins, no sign of any recent habitation. Kevin pulled out his phone to call the number from his reservation, but there was no signal. He tried to access the lodge's website but couldn't get online. The sun was setting behind the mountains and the temperature was dropping fast. He needed to find shelter soon. That's when he saw the light. It was just a flicker at first, like a candle flame visible through the trees. But as he watched, more lights appeared. Warm, yellow lights that looked like they were coming from the windows of a large building. Kevin blinked and rubbed his eyes, wondering if he was seeing things. When he looked again, the lodge was there. A massive log structure with steep roofs and multiple chimneys, exactly like the photos on the website. Warm light spilled from dozens of windows and smoke curled up from the chimneys into the darkening sky. Kevin could even hear faint sounds of music and conversation coming from inside. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the building that definitely hadn't been there 5 minutes earlier. But he was cold, tired, and had nowhere else to go. Maybe he'd just missed it in the failing light. Maybe the trees had hidden it from his view. There had to be a rational explanation. Kevin grabbed his bags from the car and walked up to the front entrance. The lodge looked exactly like the website photos. Rustic but well-maintained, with carved wooden details and large windows that showed glimpses of a cozy interior. A wooden sign by the door read, "Welcome to Whispering Pines Lodge. Your home away from home." The front door opened before he could knock. A smiling woman in her 50s greeted him, wearing what looked like traditional mountain lodge attire, a wool sweater and long skirt that seemed to be from an earlier era. "Mr. Thompson, we've been expecting you," she said warmly. "I'm Margaret, the lodge manager. Welcome to Whispering Pines." Kevin was relieved to finally be acknowledged. "Thank you. I was starting to think I'd gotten lost. I couldn't see the lodge from the parking area." Margaret laughed, a sound like wind chimes. "Oh, that happens sometimes. The lodge can be hard to spot until you really need to find it. Come in, come in. You must be freezing." The interior was perfect. Everything Kevin had hoped for in a mountain retreat. A massive stone fireplace dominated the main room, surrounded by comfortable chairs and couches. Mounted deer heads and vintage ski equipment decorated the walls. Other guests sat around the fire, chatting quietly and sipping drinks from steaming mugs. Margaret led him to the front desk, an antique wooden counter topped with an old-fashioned guest register. "Just sign in here," she said, pointing to an ornate book with a leather cover. "We're a bit old-fashioned about our record-keeping." Kevin signed his name and noticed that the other signatures on the page looked faded, as if they'd been written in a different kind of ink. Some of the names were accompanied by dates from decades past. He was about to ask about it when Margaret closed the book. "Let me show you to your room," she said, taking a brass key from a board behind the desk. "You're in room 237, one of our nicest accommodations." She led him up a creaking wooden staircase lined with vintage photographs of the lodge and its guests. The photos seemed to span many decades, showing people in skiing attire from different eras. Kevin noticed that all the people in the photos looked happy, but there was something strange about their smiles. Too wide, too fixed, like they'd been posed for too long. Room 237 was cozy and well-appointed, with a comfortable bed, a small fireplace, and a window that looked out over the ski slopes. Kevin could see the trails clearly in the moonlight, groomed and ready for skiing. "Breakfast is served from 7 to 10, Margaret said. "The lifts start running at 8:30 and we have complimentary equipment rental if you need it." "Is there anything else you need tonight?" Kevin was about to ask about Wi-Fi and cell service, but he was suddenly very tired. The warm room and comfortable bed looked incredibly inviting after his long day of travel. "No, I think I'm all set," he said. "Thank you for everything." Margaret smiled that too wide smile. "Sleep well, Mr. Thompson. Tomorrow is going to be a wonderful day." Kevin slept better than he had in months. The bed was incredibly comfortable, and the mountain air coming through the slightly open window was crisp and clean. He dreamed of skiing perfect powder snow under a bright blue sky. He woke up naturally around 7 a.m. and went downstairs for breakfast. The dining room was filled with other guests, all chatting animatedly about their skiing plans. Kevin noticed that everyone seemed to be wearing vintage ski clothing, wool sweaters, knicker-style pants, and equipment that looked like it was from the 1950s or 60s. The food was delicious. Hearty mountain fare with fresh eggs, thick-cut bacon, and homemade bread. Kevin sat at a table with a couple who introduced themselves as Robert and Helen. "First time at Whispering Pines?" Robert asked, adjusting his vintage wool sweater. "Yes, I've been looking forward to this for months," Kevin replied. "How long have you been coming here?" Helen smiled that same too wide smile he'd noticed on Margaret. "Oh, we've been coming here for years. Decades, really. It's such a wonderful place. You never want to leave." "The skiing here is incredible," Robert added. "Perfect conditions every day, no crowds, no lift lines. It's like having the entire mountain to yourself." Kevin looked out the dining room windows at the ski slopes. In the morning light, he could see that the trails looked pristine with fresh snow and perfect grooming, but something seemed odd about the scene. There were no other ski areas visible on adjacent mountains, no signs of civilization beyond the lodge itself. "Where exactly are we?" Kevin asked. "I mean, what ski resort is this connected to?" Robert and Helen exchanged a quick glance. "This is Whispering Pines Resort," Helen said carefully. "It's been here since 1952. Family-owned and operated, very exclusive. That's why it's so peaceful." Kevin nodded, but he was starting to feel uneasy. He excused himself from breakfast and went back to his room to check his phone. Still no signal, and his GPS showed his location as being in the middle of empty forest, nowhere near any documented ski resort. He decided to investigate the lodge more thoroughly. Walking through the halls, he noticed that all the vintage photographs on the wall showed the same group of people over and over again. Robert and Helen, Margaret, and about 20 other guests. The photos spanned what looked like several decades, but the people in them never seemed to age. Kevin found a library off the main lobby and started looking through old guest registers and resort brochures. What he discovered made his blood run cold. According to the documents, Whispering Pines Lodge had operated from 1952 to 1978, when it was destroyed in a fire that killed 37 guests and staff members. The resort was never rebuilt, but he was here now, eating breakfast and planning to ski. How was that possible? Kevin rushed back to his room and started packing his bags. Something was very wrong with this place, and he needed to leave immediately. But when he tried to leave his room, the door wouldn't open. The handle turned, but the door itself seemed to be stuck. He went to the window and tried to open it, but it was sealed shut. Looking down at the parking area, he could see his car. But it looked different. Older, covered in more snow than it should have been after just one night. A knock at his door made him jump. "Mr. Thompson?" It was Margaret's voice. "Is everything all right? You missed the morning ski departure." Kevin pressed his back against the door. "I'm not feeling well," he called out. "I think I need to leave today." "Oh, that's too bad," Margaret said, and Kevin could hear the fake sympathy in her voice. "But I'm afraid that's not possible. You see, guests at Whispering Pines don't really leave. Once you're here, you become part of our family." "What do you mean?" Kevin demanded. "The fire in 1978 was tragic," Margaret continued through the door. "But it didn't really end anything. It just changed the nature of our existence. We're still here, Mr. Thompson. We're still operating the lodge, still welcoming guests, still providing the perfect ski vacation experience. Forever." Kevin realized, with growing horror, that he was trapped in a place that shouldn't exist, surrounded by people who had been dead for over 40 years. The lodge, the other guests, Margaret, they were all ghosts maintaining their routines decades after their deaths. "Please," he said through the door. "I just want to go home." "But why would you want to leave?" Margaret asked, her voice becoming colder. "You'll have perfect skiing every day, wonderful company. No worries about the outside world. You'll be part of our family, Kevin, forever and ever." Kevin heard footsteps moving away from his door. He was alone, but he knew it wouldn't last long. They would come for him soon, try to convince him to stay, to become another permanent guest at their impossible lodge. He had to escape. Kevin grabbed a chair and smashed it against the window, but the glass wouldn't break. The chair bounced off like it had hit steel. He tried the fireplace poker on the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the room had become a perfectly sealed prison. Hours passed. Kevin could hear the sounds of lodge life continuing outside his door, guests chatting in the hallways, footsteps on the stairs, the clink of dishes from the dining room, normal sounds that became terrifying when you realized they were being made by people who had died decades ago. As evening approached, Kevin heard music coming from downstairs. He pressed his ear to the door and could make out the sounds of a party. People laughing, dancing, having a wonderful time. It sounded exactly like the kind of resort experience he'd been hoping for. The door opened suddenly, and Kevin stumbled backward. Margaret stood in the doorway, still smiling, but her eyes looked different now. Darker, more hollow. "Time for dinner, Mr. Thompson," she said pleasantly. "Everyone's waiting for you." Kevin had no choice but to follow her downstairs. The main room had been transformed into a party space, with all the guests dressed in formal attire from different decades. They were dancing to music that seemed to come from nowhere, their movements graceful but somehow wrong, too fluid, too synchronized. "Welcome to your welcome party," Margaret announced as they entered the room. All the guests turned to look at Kevin, their faces bright with those two wide smiles. Robert approached with a drink in his hand. "You're going to love it here, Kevin," he said. "We all do. We've been having the same wonderful time for over 40 years. The skiing is perfect every day," Helen added, gliding over in a dress that looked like it was from the 1960s. The snow never melts, the weather is always ideal, and the company is delightful. Kevin looked around the room and realized that everyone was staring at him with the same expression: hungry, desperate, lonely. They were trapped here, repeating the same routines over and over, and they wanted him to join them in their eternal vacation from hell. "I don't want to stay," Kevin said firmly. "I want to go home." The music stopped suddenly. All the guests turned to look at him with expressions of shock and hurt. "But why would you want to leave?" Margaret asked, her voice taking on an edge of desperation. "We're offering you paradise. Perfect skiing, perfect weather, perfect companionship. No bills to pay, no job to worry about, no aging, no death. Just eternal vacation." "Because it's not real," Kevin said. "You're all dead. This place burned down 40 years ago. I don't want to be trapped here forever." The guests began to close in around him, their smiles becoming more strained, more desperate. "You don't understand," Robert said. "We can't let you leave. If you leave, you might tell people about us. You might bring investigators. You might ruin everything we've built here." "Besides," Helen added, "where would you go?" "Look outside." Kevin turned toward the windows and saw that the world beyond the lodge had changed. Instead of the forest and mountains he remembered, there was only swirling white emptiness like a blizzard that never ended. "This is our world now," Margaret explained. "The lodge and the ski slopes. Nothing else exists for us. And if you stay, nothing else will exist for you either. You'll be happy here, Kevin. We're all happy." But looking at their faces, Kevin could see that they weren't happy. They were desperate, lonely, terrified of being alone in their eternal prison. They needed him to join them, to validate their existence, to help them pretend that their endless vacation was actually a good thing. Kevin made a run for the front door, but it had disappeared. The wall where the door should have been was solid wood, as if there had never been an exit at all. The windows showed only that swirling white void. He was trapped in the lodge with 37 dead people who wanted him to pretend to be happy for the rest of eternity. The guests were closing in around him now, their hands reaching out, their faces pleading. "Stay with us," they chanted. "Stay and ski with us. Stay and be happy with us. Stay and never leave us alone again." Kevin closed his eyes and concentrated on the real world, on his life outside this impossible place. He thought about his job, his friends, his apartment, all the things that Margaret claimed he wouldn't need to worry about anymore. But those things were what made him real, what made him alive. When he opened his eyes, cracks had appeared in the walls of the lodge. Through the cracks he could see the real world outside, the empty clearing, the concrete foundations, the ruins of a building that had burned down decades ago. "No!" Margaret screamed. "You can't leave. You can't abandon us." But Kevin was already fading from their world, returning to reality. The last thing he saw was the desperate faces of the dead guests, reaching out to him as their perfect lodge crumbled around them. He found himself standing in the empty clearing next to his car in broad daylight. His bags were still in the back seat where he'd left them. According to his phone, only a few hours had passed since he'd arrived, though he'd experienced an entire night at the lodge. Kevin drove away as fast as he could, not stopping until he reached the highway. Behind him, the clearing looked empty and abandoned just like it had when he'd first arrived. But sometimes when he looked in his rearview mirror, he thought he could see lights in the forest and figures standing among the trees, waving at him to come back. He never went skiing alone again. And he always made sure to verify that his destination actually existed before making the trip, because he learned that some places are so hungry for guests that they'll reach across the boundary between life and death to find them. Local records confirm that Whispering Pines Lodge operated from 1952 to 1978, when it was destroyed in a fire that killed 37 people. The cause of the fire was never determined, but investigators noted that all the victims were found in the main lodge building, as if they'd been attending some kind of gathering. The property has remained empty since then, though there have been occasional reports from hikers and campers of lights in the forest and sounds of music and laughter coming from the ruins. Real estate developers have tried to buy the land several times, but all the deals have fallen through for unexplained reasons. And sometimes, people driving through the area report seeing a beautiful mountain lodge where they know only ruins should be, especially when they're tired or lost or desperately looking for somewhere to stay the night. Most are smart enough to keep driving, but a few stop to investigate. Those are the ones who are never seen again.